Judge Henry Pearson never expected that a chance encounter behind a courthouse dumpster would change his life forever. Taking in two homeless twins, he gave them a home, love, and a second chance at life. Years later, just as their family seems unshakable, a single phone call shatters their world. What secrets from their past resurface? And how will this unexpected twist challenge the bond they've worked so hard to build? This is a story of family, resilience, and the life-changing power of love you won't forget. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn evening cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Henry Pearson loosened his tie. His shoulders sagged under the weight of a particularly difficult custody battle that had dragged on all afternoon. The judge's gavel felt heavy in his hand as he placed it carefully in his briefcase, his mind still echoing with the angry voices from the courtroom. The parking lot was nearly empty, most of his colleagues having left hours ago. His footsteps echoed against the concrete as he walked toward his car, the cool October air nipping at his face. A sudden rustling sound stopped him mid-stride. There it was again, coming from behind the large dumpster near the building's service entrance. Henry hesitated. After 15 years on the bench, he'd learned to be cautious. But something about the sound, a whispered shh, followed by what seemed like a child's cough, made him turn toward the noise instead of away from it. "Hello?" he called softly, approaching the dumpster. "Is someone there?" Two small figures froze in the dim light. One boy stood protectively in front of the other, his thin frame rigid with fear but determination evident in his stance. Both children wore clothes that hung loose on their frames, dirty and worn. "We're not doing anything wrong," the larger boy said, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "We'll leave right now." Henry's heart clenched as he noticed the younger boy clutching a half-eaten sandwich. "It's okay," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm Judge Pearson. What are your names?" The older boy hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "I'm Gabriel. This is my brother Grant." "We're twins," Grant whispered, speaking for the first time. Henry noticed how Gabriel shifted slightly, keeping himself between his brother and any potential threat. "Where are your parents?" he asked, already dreading the answer. Gabriel's composure cracked slightly. "They died. Car crash. 3 weeks ago." "We've been okay, though," Grant added quickly, looking to his brother for reassurance. Henry knelt down, bringing himself to their eye level. "Have you been staying somewhere?" "Different places," Gabriel said vaguely. "We move around." The late autumn wind gusted through the parking lot, making both boys shiver. Henry made a decision. "There's a shelter not far from here. Would you let me take you there? It's warm, and they'll have proper food." Gabriel studied him intently, weighing their options. Finally, he nodded. The drive to the shelter was quiet, broken only by Gabriel's occasional answers to Henry's gentle questions. From the back seat, Henry could see Grant leaning against his brother's shoulder, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. At the shelter, the intake worker's face grew grave as she verified the boy's story. "We're packed tight," she told Henry quietly. "Finding placement for siblings is always challenging. We'll do our best, but—" Henry watched as the boys were led away to get cleaned up. Gabriel glanced back once, offering a small wave that made Henry's throat tight. The drive home felt longer than usual. Henry's house, always quiet since Sarah's death, seemed especially empty tonight. He sat in his favorite armchair, staring at the family photos on the mantel. The image of those two boys alone in the world except for each other wouldn't leave his mind. The morning sunlight streamed through Henry's office window, but he couldn't concentrate on the legal documents spread across his desk. His pen tapped restlessly against the mahogany surface as his mind kept drifting back to the two boys he'd found last night. With a sigh, he closed the brief he'd been trying to read for the past hour. Sarah would have known exactly what to do, he murmured to himself, glancing at the photo of his late wife on his desk. Making a quick decision, he grabbed his coat and keys. 20 minutes later, Henry pulled into the shelter's parking lot, carrying 2 paper bags from Marie's diner. The familiar scent of chicken soup and fresh bread filled his car. Inside the shelter, he found Gabriel and Grant sitting at a corner table, Their shoulders hunched as they whispered to each other. "Good morning," Henry said softly, approaching their table. Both boys looked up, startled. "Judge Pearson?" Gabriel's eyes widened. "You came back?" Henry set the bags on the table. "I thought you might like some hot soup. And please, call me Henry." Grant's face lit up at the sight of food, but he waited for Gabriel's nod before reaching for a bag. The smell of warm bread made his stomach growl audibly. "Thank you," Gabriel said, helping Grant open his container. "You didn't have to do this." Henry sat down across from them, watching as they began to eat. "Would you tell me about your parents?" Gabriel paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Mom was a teacher," he said finally. "She taught 3rd grade. Dad worked at the bank downtown. They used to take us camping," Grant added quietly. "Dad knew all the constellations." Gabriel quickly jumped in. "That was before the accident. We were staying with Mrs. Cooper next door, but she got sick and couldn't keep us anymore." Henry noticed how Gabriel's hand moved to rest protectively on Grant's shoulder when the younger boy's eyes began to water. "And you've been moving between shelters since then?" "We have to stay together," Gabriel said firmly. "Some places wanted to split us up, but I promised Mom and Dad I'd take care of Grant." "I want to stay with Gabriel," Grant whispered, leaning into his brother's side. Henry watched as Gabriel expertly diverted the conversation, asking Grant about the book he'd found in the shelter's small library. The older twin's voice remained steady, but Henry could see the weight of responsibility in his young eyes. "What would you like to do when you're older?" Henry asked, trying to lift the mood. "I want to be a teacher like Mom," Gabriel said, his voice softening. "But mostly, I just want us to have a home again." Grant nodded eagerly. "With a backyard and maybe a dog?" "Maybe someday," Gabriel said gently, though Henry could hear the doubt in his voice. When it was time to leave, Henry felt his chest tighten as he walked to his car. The thought of his empty house seemed less appealing than ever, knowing the boys would spend another night in the crowded shelter. As he drove home, their faces stayed with him, Grant's quiet hope and Gabriel's determined protection of his brother, stirring something deep in his heart. The social services office buzzed with activity as Henry sat across from Ms. Martinez, a veteran caseworker with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She flipped through the boy's file, her expression grave. "The situation is complicated, Judge Pearson," she said, looking up at him. "We're facing a severe shortage of homes willing to take siblings. Most likely, they'll be placed separately." Henry's stomach clenched. "What if I offered to foster them?" Ms. Martinez set down her pen, studying him carefully. "Fostering twins, especially after trauma, requires significant commitment. They'll need therapy, constant support, and patience. Your schedule as a judge?" "I can adjust my schedule," Henry interrupted, then caught himself. "I apologize, but I've given this serious thought." Later that morning, Henry found himself in Judge Eleanor Ward's chambers. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows as Eleanor poured them both coffee. "Henry, this is a huge step," she said, settling into her leather chair. "Those boys need more than just a roof over their heads." "I know, Ellie." Henry wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "But when I see them, I can't help thinking about what Sarah would say." Eleanor's expression softened at the mention of his late wife. Sarah had a gift with children. She would have opened her heart to them immediately. She would have known exactly how to help them heal, Henry said quietly. "I might not have her natural ability, but I can't walk away from this." "The demands will be enormous," Eleanor warned. "Court schedules, emergency hearings, not to mention the emotional toll. These boys have been through tremendous loss." Henry nodded, remembering Gabriel's protective stance and Grant's quiet withdrawal. "I've been living in a bubble since Sarah died. Maybe it's time to step out." Back at social services, Ms. Martinez walked Henry through the fostering process. "We'll need background checks, home inspections, and you'll have to complete mandatory training courses." "Whatever it takes," Henry said firmly. "Judge Pearson," Ms. Martinez leaned forward, "I want to be clear. This is temporary placement. The boy's future permanent situation will depend on many factors." Henry signed form after form, his judge's training helping him absorb the legal requirements. Each signature brought Gabriel and Grant closer to having a stable home, even if temporary. His hand paused over the final document as Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in his mind, encouraging him forward. The last paper received his signature and Ms. Martinez gathered the forms. "We'll expedite the process given your position and the boys' urgent situation, but there's still more to complete." Henry stood, feeling both lighter and heavier with his decision. His quiet house would soon be transformed, and while uncertainty gnawed at him, he felt more alive than he had in years. "Your wife would be proud," Eleanor said as she walked him to his car later. "Just remember, you're not alone in this. You have friends who will support you." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the shelter's parking lot as Henry pulled up in his sedan. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Gabriel and Grant stood on the curb, each holding a small backpack that contained their entire world. "Ready to go home?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice light and welcoming. The boys climbed into the back seat, Grant sliding in first with Gabriel protectively following. Their backpacks stayed on their laps, held tight against their chests. "I made up your room this morning," Henry said, glancing in the rearview mirror as he drove. "I hope you like blue. The comforters are navy." "Blue's Grant's favorite color," Gabriel offered quietly, giving his brother's hand a squeeze. The drive was mostly silent after that, broken only by Henry's occasional comments about landmarks they passed. When they pulled into the driveway of the two-story Colonial, Grant's eyes widened slightly. Inside, Henry led them upstairs to their room. Two twin beds faced each other across the space, dressed in new bedding. A small desk sat under the window, and a box of toys waited in the corner, items Henry had hurriedly purchased the day before. "You can arrange things however you'd like," Henry said, watching as Gabriel immediately began organizing their few possessions. "Grant, let me help you make your bed," Gabriel said, already pulling out their worn blanket from his backpack. At dinner, they sat around Henry's kitchen table, the silence broken only by the quiet clink of forks against plates. Henry had ordered pizza, hoping the casual meal would help everyone relax. "My wife Sarah," Henry began, surprising himself. "She used to say pizza was the perfect food for making friends." He smiled at the memory. "She'd order it whenever we had new neighbors over." Grant looked up from his barely touched slice. "Our mom made pizza sometimes," he said softly. "From scratch." Gabriel nodded, his own pizza forgotten. "She'd let us help knead the dough. Dad would throw it up in the air to make us laugh, even though Mom said he'd drop it." "Did he? Drop it, I mean?" Henry asked gently. "Once," Gabriel smiled slightly. "It landed right on his head. Mom couldn't stop laughing." Grant's lower lip trembled. "I miss her," he whispered. Henry felt his throat tighten. "I know exactly what you mean. I miss Sarah every day. Sometimes it feels like a hole in your heart, doesn't it?" Grant nodded, and Gabriel wrapped an arm around his brother's shoulders. Later that night, Henry showed them where to find extra blankets and the bathroom light. As he turned to leave their room, he paused at the door, his hand on the light switch. "Sleep well, boys," he said softly. "Thank you," Gabriel whispered in the darkness, his voice carrying a weight beyond his years. Henry juggled a stack of legal briefs in one hand while attempting to flip pancakes with the other. The kitchen counter was covered in flour, and his usually pristine tie had a suspicious smudge of pancake batter. "Let me help with that, Henry," Gabriel offered, reaching for the spatula. Grant trailed behind his brother, clutching plates to set the table. "I've got it under control," Henry insisted, just as a pancake landed half-folded on the stovetop. "Well, mostly under control." Gabriel suppressed a smile and grabbed paper towels to clean up the mess. Grant giggled softly, a sound that still surprised Henry whenever he heard it. "Maybe we should have cereal," Grant suggested quietly, opening a cabinet. As they scrambled to salvage breakfast, Henry's phone buzzed with messages about his morning court session. The boys exchanged knowing looks. They'd grown used to these hectic mornings over the past few weeks. Each day followed a similar pattern. Henry would rush off to court while Gabriel made sure Grant had everything packed for school. The older twin had memorized their schedule perfectly. Homework in backpacks, lunch money in pockets, and Grant's inhaler always within reach. After school, Henry would often find them already settled at the kitchen table, Gabriel helping Grant with math problems while snacking on whatever they could find in the pantry. The sight always filled him with equal parts gratitude and guilt, grateful for Gabriel's responsibility, but guilty that he couldn't be there himself. "How was school today?" Henry asked one evening as he set down takeout containers of Chinese food. "Some kids asked why we have different last names than you," Gabriel said, passing the rice to Grant. Henry's heart tightened. "What did you tell them?" "That you're taking care of us," Grant answered, his voice stronger than usual, "like how Gabriel takes care of me." Later that evening, Henry pulled out an old Monopoly board. "Anyone up for a game?" To everyone's surprise, Grant proved to be a shrewd property mogul. He accumulated hotels on Boardwalk and Park Place, gleefully collecting rent from his brother and Henry. "Where did you learn to play like this?" Henry asked, handing over his last few $100 after landing on Boardwalk. "Mom taught me," Grant said, carefully arranging his colorful money. "She said I had good business sense." Gabriel beamed at his brother's enthusiasm, and Henry felt something warm settle in his chest as he watched them. The evening filled with laughter as Grant systematically bankrupted them both. As Henry tucked them into bed that night, Grant was still grinning about his victory. Gabriel yawned and pulled his blanket up to his chin, looking more relaxed than Henry had ever seen him. "Good night, boys," Henry said softly, pausing at the doorway. "Good night, Henry," they replied in unison, their voices carrying the comfortable familiarity of home. The Sunday morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm golden squares across the tile floor as Henry adjusted his tie in the hallway mirror. His fingers worked the silk with practiced precision while he glanced at Gabriel and Grant, who stood awkwardly in their borrowed dress shirts and slacks from the church donation box. The clothes were slightly ill-fitting but clean and pressed, a reminder of their current circumstances. "You boys ready?" Henry asked, trying to keep his voice light despite his own nervousness. His hands smoothed down his jacket, a gesture more from habit than necessity. Gabriel nodded stiffly while Grant fidgeted with his collar, his thin fingers working at the starched fabric. It had been months since Henry last attended service, and years since he'd gone regularly. After Sarah's death, the familiar pews had felt too empty, the hymns too painful. Each Sunday had been a reminder of what he'd lost. The church parking lot was filling up when they arrived, cars lined up neatly under the shade of old oak trees. Henry guided the boys through the heavy wooden double doors, where they were immediately greeted by warm smiles and gentle handshakes. Mrs. Thompson, who'd known Henry since he first moved to town 20 years ago, wrapped them in a grandmotherly embrace, her floral perfume enveloping them. "Welcome, welcome," she exclaimed, patting Grant's shoulder with a weathered hand. "We're so happy to have you here." Her eyes crinkled with genuine warmth as she looked at each of them in turn. During the service, Henry watched as Grant gradually relaxed, swaying slightly to the worship music, his shoulders losing their tension. Gabriel remained alert, his eyes darting between the exits and his brother, old habits dying hard. But even he seemed to soften when the congregation joined in singing "Amazing Grace," his fingers unconsciously tapping against his leg to the familiar melody. Pastor Evans's sermon that morning focused on God's perfect timing. "Sometimes," he said, his kind eyes finding Henry in the crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary, "our greatest blessings come disguised as challenges, and our deepest wounds can lead us to our most meaningful purpose." After the service, church members gathered around them in the fellowship hall, the room buzzing with conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. Mrs. Baker offered to organize a meal train, while Mr. Wilson suggested a fundraiser to help with the boys' expenses, his business mind already working out the details. "That's very kind," Henry said, touched but embarrassed by the attention, his cheeks coloring slightly. "But we're managing just fine." Pastor Evans pulled Henry aside while the boys sampled Mrs. Thompson's famous snickerdoodles, the sweet cinnamon aroma wafting through the air. "They're wonderful boys, Henry," he said quietly, his hand resting on Henry's shoulder. "Sarah would be proud of what you're doing." Henry swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. "I'm just trying to give them a safe place to stay for now." "Perhaps God has bigger plans," Pastor Evans suggested gently, wisdom gleaming in his eyes. "Sometimes temporary arrangements become permanent blessings." The drive home was quiet but comfortable, the afternoon sun warming the car's interior. Grant broke the silence as they turned onto their street, the familiar houses sliding past. "Thank you for taking us today, Henry." In the rearview mirror, Henry caught Gabriel's slight nod of agreement. The boy's usually guarded expression softened. His heart felt fuller than it had in years, like maybe this was exactly where they all needed to be, the pieces of their broken. The kitchen hummed with comfortable silence as Gabriel worked through his math homework, his pencil scratching steadily against paper. Grant sat across from him, absorbed in his sketchbook, occasionally tilting his head to study his work from a different angle. Henry prepared chamomile tea at the counter, carefully measuring loose leaves into the steeping pot, an evening ritual he'd grown to cherish. Steam rose from 3 mugs as Henry carried them to the table, setting one beside each boy with practiced care. "Thank you," Gabriel said without looking up from his equations, his brow furrowed in concentration as he tackled another complex problem. Henry settled into his chair, enjoying the peaceful scene before him. The evening light cast a warm glow through the kitchen windows, painting golden rectangles across the worn wooden table. The familiar scent of chamomile filled the air, mingling with the subtle aroma of the chocolate chip cookies they'd baked together earlier. These quiet moments had become precious to him over the past weeks, each one a small gift he tucked away in his heart. Grant's pencil stilled above his drawing, hovering uncertainly. He glanced up at Henry, his eyes carrying a weight beyond his years, shadows of past hurts visible in their depths. "Henry?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, trembling slightly with unspoken emotion. "Yes, Grant?" "Are you?" Grant paused, fidgeting with his pencil, rolling it between his fingers as if it could give him courage. "Are you going to keep us forever?" The question hung in the air like delicate crystal, fragile and precious. Gabriel's hand froze mid-calculation, though he kept his eyes fixed on his homework, his shoulders growing tense. Henry's heart tightened in his chest as he carefully set down his mug, the soft clink against the table seeming unusually loud in the weighted silence. "I know we're just foster kids," Grant continued quickly, his words tumbling out like water from a broken dam. "But I really like it here, with you." His voice grew smaller, almost disappearing entirely. "I don't want to leave." Henry leaned forward, noticing how Gabriel's shoulders had tensed, though he remained silent, his pencil gripped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "You boys are safe here," Henry said gently, infusing each word with warmth and sincerity. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be." "But what if someone else wants to adopt us?" Grant's fingers twisted around his pencil until it seemed ready to snap. "What if they split us up?" Gabriel finally looked up, his protective instincts visible in the set of his jaw, but vulnerability flickered in his eyes like a candle flame in the wind. Henry recognized the fear both boys carried, the same fear that had brought them together that night by the courthouse dumpster, huddled against the cold and uncertainty. "Listen to me," Henry said, his voice steady and warm as summer sunshine. "You will always have a place here, both of you, together." He reached out, placing one hand on Grant's shoulder and the other on Gabriel's, feeling the slight tremor in each boy's frame. "This is your home now." Grant's face brightened slightly, hope replacing worry in his expression like clouds parting after a storm. Gabriel's posture relaxed, though he maintained his characteristic reserve, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The moment felt weighty with possibility, with unspoken promises and growing trust, binding them together in ways that went far deeper than legal documents. Later that evening, Henry sat in his study, gazing at Sarah's photograph on his desk, her familiar features illuminated by the warm glow of his desk lamp. Her smile seemed to shine with approval in the lamplight, as if she knew all along this was meant to be. He touched the frame gently, his fingers tracing its familiar edges, remembering how she'd always wanted children, how they'd planned to start a family before illness took her too soon. In the quiet of his study, he could almost hear her whisper, "This is right, Henry. This is exactly right." Henry's footsteps echoed through the marble-lined courthouse hallway as he approached his lawyer's office, each step bringing him closer to a life-changing moment. His hands felt clammy as he straightened his navy silk tie for the third time that morning, but determination steadied his stride. Inside the warmly lit office, Mr. Davidson, his silver hair neatly combed, had already laid out the thick stack of adoption paperwork across his gleaming mahogany desk. "Good morning, Henry," Mr. Davidson said warmly, gesturing to the leather chair across from him. "Are you ready to begin?" Henry nodded, taking his seat with measured composure. As he picked up the heavy silver pen, memories of the past few months with Gabriel and Grant flooded his mind. Shared meals, homework sessions, quiet conversations, strengthening his resolve. "Now you understand this is just the beginning," Mr. Davidson explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The process can take several months, possibly longer, given the complexities involved." "I understand," Henry replied, carefully signing each document with deliberate strokes. Later that afternoon in the wood-paneled judge's chambers, Henry encountered raised eyebrows and concerned whispers from his colleagues. Judge Mitchell, a colleague of 20 years with whom he'd shared countless lunches, pulled him aside near the coffee station. "I know. Henry, have you really thought this through?" Mitchell asked, his voice low and worried. "2 boys at your age, with your caseload? It's quite an undertaking." Before Henry could respond, Judge Eleanor Ward, her familiar presence reassuring, stepped in. "Henry's one of our most capable judges," she said firmly, her green eyes flashing with conviction. "And those boys have brought out the best in him, anyone can see that." "I appreciate the concern," Henry replied diplomatically, straightening his shoulders. "But I've never been more certain about anything in my life." Eleanor walked with him to his office afterward, her heels clicking softly on the floor. "It won't be easy," she cautioned, her voice gentle. "But I've seen how you are with them. You're already a family. Anyone can see that." Back home that evening, Henry watched Gabriel help Grant with his science project at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over a colorful display board about the solar system. The scene before him warmed his heart, filling the once quiet house with purpose. "Dad," Grant called out absently, focused on carefully gluing a picture of Jupiter in place. "Can you check if this looks right?" Henry froze, joy spreading through his chest at the word. Grant had said it so naturally, so unconsciously, as if it had always been true. Gabriel looked up, seeming to realize what had happened, but showed no sign of discomfort, just a small knowing smile. "Sure, let me see," Henry responded, moving to join them at the table, his heart full. Later, as the boys played catch in the backyard, Henry stood at the kitchen window, a cup of cooling coffee forgotten in his hands. The setting sun painted the sky in warm oranges and pinks, matching the contentment in his heart. Gabriel's laughter rang out, a sound that had become more frequent lately, as Grant dramatically dove to catch the ball, landing in a pile of autumn leaves. The adoption papers sat in his briefcase, just the first step in a long journey ahead. But watching his boys, because that's truly what they were now, Henry felt complete certainty wash over him like a warm blanket. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family, bound by something far stronger than mere paperwork. Henry's hands trembled as he held the official letter from the court. After months of waiting, hoping, and praying, the adoption was finally approved. He read the words again, letting them sink in. Gabriel and Grant were legally his sons. Checking his watch, he realized it was almost time for school dismissal. He grabbed his keys, heart racing with excitement as he drove to pick up the boys. As they climbed into the car, Henry worked to keep his expression neutral, though his smile threatened to break through. "How was school?" he asked casually. "Fine," Gabriel replied, giving him a curious look. "Didn't you have court today?" "Changed my schedule a bit," Henry said, catching Grant's wide-eyed expression in the rearview mirror. At home, Henry prepared their favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs. The familiar scent of garlic bread filled the kitchen as the boys set the table, falling into their usual routine. Once they were seated, Henry cleared his throat. "I have some news," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "The adoption, it's official. You're my sons now, legally and forever." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but to Henry it felt like hours. Then Grant launched himself from his chair, wrapping his arms around Henry's neck with such force that they nearly toppled over. "Really?" Grant's voice cracked. Really? Gabriel sat very still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face, not his usual reserved expression, but a genuine bright grin that reached his eyes. "So we can stay? Forever?" Gabriel asked quietly. "Forever," Henry confirmed, reaching out to squeeze Gabriel's hand. They planned a celebration for Saturday afternoon. Judge Eleanor Ward arrived first, bearing a homemade chocolate cake. Church members filtered in, filling the house with warmth and congratulations. During the celebration, Gabriel stood up, surprising everyone with his desire to speak. "Grant and I want to say something," he announced, his voice steady despite his nervous fidgeting. "Thank you, Dad, for giving us a home." The word "Dad" hung in the air, precious and perfect. Henry felt tears welling up as Grant chimed in, "Yeah, thanks, Dad." Later, as Grant helped himself to a third piece of cake, Gabriel couldn't resist teasing, "Save some for the rest of us, Grant." "It's my celebration too," Grant protested through a mouthful of frosting, making everyone laugh. Judge Ward approached Henry, who was watching the boys with undisguised joy. "You've done something remarkable here," she said softly. "Those boys have bloomed under your care." As the afternoon wore on and guests began to leave, the new family settled into their living room. Grant curled up next to Henry on the couch while Gabriel sat cross-legged on the floor, leafing through a photo album someone had brought as a gift. The quiet contentment in the room felt like a warm blanket wrapped around them all. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Henry flipped pancakes at the stove. The sizzle of butter and sweet aroma of maple syrup filled the air. Gabriel sat at the counter, organizing his backpack while Grant traced patterns in the condensation on his orange juice glass. "I have a science project due next week," Grant announced. "We're studying the solar system." "Maybe we can get some books from the library after school," Henry suggested, sliding a stack of pancakes onto Gabriel's plate. "I could help," Gabriel offered. "I remember doing that project last year." Their morning routine had become comfortable, familiar. The initial awkwardness of their early days together had melted into natural conversations and casual affection. That evening, after dinner dishes were cleared, they gathered in the living room. The setting sun cast long shadows across the carpet as Henry settled into his favorite armchair. Grant sprawled on the floor with a pillow, while Gabriel perched on the edge of the couch. "Tell me about your mom's cooking," Henry said softly, noticing Grant's earlier wistful expression when they'd made dinner. Grant's face lit up. "She made the best chocolate chip cookies. She'd let us lick the spoon and the whole house would smell amazing." Gabriel nodded, adding, "Every Sunday she'd make these huge breakfasts. Dad called them feast days." His voice grew quieter. After they were gone, I tried making pancakes for Grant, but they were always burned." Henry listened as Gabriel described those first difficult weeks, searching for food, trying to stay warm, protecting Grant from the harsh realities of their situation. The weight of responsibility in Gabriel's young voice made Henry's heart ache. "You know what?" Henry said, leaning forward. "My Sarah would have loved you both." He smiled, remembering. She always said life's greatest purpose was helping others. When things got tough at work, she'd remind me that every decision I made could change someone's life. "Is that why you became a judge?" Grant asked. Henry nodded. "And it's why I couldn't walk away when I found you two." Gabriel sat up straighter. "I think I want to be a teacher," he announced. "I like helping kids understand things." "I want to help people too," Grant chimed in, "like maybe an EMT or something, someone who makes things better when they're scary." Henry watched his sons share their dreams, marveling at their resilience. These conversations had become more frequent lately, usually during their Friday game nights or Sunday morning walks, traditions that had naturally evolved in their household. As the evening grew cooler, they moved to the back porch. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky, twinkling like distant promises. Grant pointed out constellations he'd learned about in school, while Gabriel quietly named the ones their mother had taught them. Henry sat between his sons, feeling the profound rightness of this moment. In the peaceful quiet, he thought of Sarah, remembering how she'd always insisted that love could heal any wound. The years had passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. Henry sat in the back of a high school classroom, watching Gabriel lead a history lesson with natural ease. His son's voice carried confidence as he explained the Civil War to a group of attentive teenagers, gesturing to maps and engaging even the most distracted students. Later that week, Grant burst through the front door, still wearing his EMT trainee uniform, his eyes bright with excitement. "Dad, you won't believe what we learned today." He launched into a detailed description of emergency response protocols while Henry prepared dinner, nodding and smiling at his youngest son's enthusiasm. That evening, the three men gathered around the dining table, the familiar scent of Henry's pot roast filling the kitchen. Time had etched subtle changes in their appearances. Gabriel's shoulders had broadened, Grant had grown taller than his twin, and silver threaded through Henry's hair. "Remember that first week we lived here?" Gabriel asked, passing the bread basket. "When Dad tried to make French toast?" Grant laughed. "The smoke alarm went off and Gabriel practically pushed you away from the stove." "In my defense," Henry chuckled, "I hadn't cooked for anyone but myself in years." "And now look at you," Gabriel said warmly, "master of the pot roast." "Speaking of mastery," Grant teased, turning to his brother, "remember how you used to make detailed schedules for everything? Even bathroom times?" Gabriel's cheeks reddened. "Someone had to keep us organized." "You still do it," Grant pointed out. "I saw your lesson planning notebook, color-coded tabs and everything." Henry watched his son's playful banter, his heart full. The retirement papers sat in his briefcase ready to be filed. After 30 years on the bench, he felt ready to step down, to focus on supporting his boys in their chosen paths. "My instructor says I'm ready for field training," Grant shared, his expression growing serious. "It's exciting but scary too. I keep thinking about how one decision could change someone's life." "Like finding two boys by a dumpster?" Henry asked softly. Gabriel reached over and squeezed Henry's hand. "Exactly like that." The conversation flowed easily as they shared memories and hopes for the future. Henry noticed how Gabriel still watched over Grant, but the protective instinct had mellowed into something more balanced. Grant had found his own strength, his natural compassion finding purpose in his chosen profession. As his sons cleared the dishes, ignoring his protests that he could help, Henry sat back in his chair. The sounds of their gentle bickering over dish duty mixed with running water and clinking plates. He thought about the frightened, hungry boys they'd once been, and marveled at the confident young men they'd become. The EMT training center buzzed with activity as trainees practiced their rescue drills. Grant moved with confidence through the simulated emergency scenario, his movements precise and focused. The instructors nodded approvingly as he demonstrated proper technique for stabilizing a mock victim. Suddenly, Grant's hands began to shake. His face turned pale, and before anyone could react, his knees buckled. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "Grant!" His instructor rushed forward, immediately checking his vital signs. Within minutes, real EMTs arrived, the irony of treating one of their trainees not lost on anyone present. At the courthouse, Henry's phone rang during a recess. His hands trembled as he listened to the news. In his classroom across town, Gabriel received a similar call. They both raced to the hospital, arriving breathless at the emergency entrance. Dr. Patel met them in a private consultation room, her expression grave. "The preliminary tests show some concerning results," she explained gently. "We've found abnormalities in Grant's blood work that indicate a serious condition." Gabriel sat perfectly still, his face a mask of control, though his whitened knuckles betrayed his tension. Henry leaned forward, his judicial composure crumbling. "How serious?" "Life-threatening if left untreated," Dr. Patel said. "We need to run more tests, but we're looking at an aggressive form of leukemia." The word hung heavy in the air. Henry felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Gabriel stood up abruptly, pulling out his phone. "I'll contact his instructors, handle the paperwork." His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he dialed. They found Grant awake in his hospital room, IV lines already attached to his arms. Despite his pallor, he managed a weak smile. "Hey, Dad." "Gabriel. Sorry for scaring everyone." Henry moved to his son's bedside, taking his hand. Gabriel stood at the foot of the bed, his protective instincts in overdrive. "The doctor told you?" Grant asked quietly. They nodded. Grant squeezed Henry's hand. "It's going to be okay. We've faced tough things before, right?" Gabriel finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Always together." Dr. Patel returned with more detailed information about treatment options. She outlined a rigorous protocol of chemotherapy and potential bone marrow transplants. Through it all, Grant listened attentively, asking clear, focused questions, his EMT training evident in his approach. That evening, Henry unlocked their front door. The house felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves sensed the weight of their news. Gabriel helped Grant settle into bed, despite his protests that he could manage. Henry sank into his favorite armchair in the living room. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. He stared at the family photos on the mantel, Grant's high school graduation, the boy's first Christmas with him, the adoption celebration. His chest tightened with a mixture of fear and determination. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together. The soft glow of Henry's desk lamp cast long shadows across the scattered papers and medical texts covering his workspace. His reading glasses sat low on his nose as he squinted at yet another research paper on experimental treatments. The clock on his wall showed 2 a.m., but sleep felt impossible with so much information to process. "Promising results in Phase 2 trials," he muttered, highlighting another passage. His printer hummed steadily, adding more pages to the growing stack of research materials. Medical terms he'd never encountered before now filled his vocabulary. Cytogenetic analysis, molecular targeting, immunotherapy protocols. The next morning, Henry sat across from Dr. Patel in her office, his notebook open and ready. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night. "There are several clinical trials showing promise," Dr. Patel explained, spreading out various documents. "This one at Mayo Clinic has particularly encouraging results for cases similar to Grant's." Henry's heart lifted momentarily, then sank as he saw the costs. The numbers seemed impossibly large, even with his judge's salary. "And insurance?" "Unfortunately, experimental treatments aren't typically covered," Dr. Patel said gently. "There are some assistance programs, but the out-of-pocket expenses would still be substantial." That evening, Henry sat at his home office making calls to research hospitals across the country. Each conversation added another note to his growing list of possibilities, and another figure to the mounting costs. He pulled up his bank statements on his computer, creating detailed spreadsheets to track every expense. His finger hovered over his retirement account balance. It was meant to secure his future. But what was that compared to Grant's life? Gabriel watched from the doorway as Henry crossed out another item from their monthly budget. "Dad, I can pick up some extra tutoring hours," he offered quietly. Henry looked up, startled. He hadn't heard Gabriel approach. "No, son. You need to focus on your teaching career. I'll figure this out." But Gabriel had already begun taking on more household responsibilities. He prepared meals, helped Grant with his medications, and managed the daily routines that Henry increasingly struggled to maintain between work and research. During his meeting with Dr. Patel about clinical trials, Henry's hands shook slightly as he signed the preliminary paperwork. "What are the success rates?" he asked, his voice steady despite his trembling fingers. "With experimental treatments, there are no guarantees," Dr. Patel answered honestly. But these trials represent our best chance at fighting Grant's specific condition. Later that night, Henry sat at the dining room table, surrounded by medical bills, insurance statements, and research papers. The numbers blurred before his tired eyes. His hand trembled as he reached for another document, but his jaw was set with determination. The cost didn't matter. The sleepless nights didn't matter. Nothing mattered except giving Grant his best chance at survival. Henry noticed the pattern gradually. Gabriel's absences grew longer, his returns home later. The house felt emptier without his steady presence, and Henry caught himself checking the clock more frequently as evening stretched into night. One Tuesday evening, well past 9, Gabriel slipped through the front door. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When Henry looked up from his paperwork, concern etched on his face. Gabriel managed a weak smile. "Just some extra tutoring sessions," he said, his voice hoarse. "Nothing to worry about, Dad." But Henry did worry. He watched as Gabriel's teaching assistant position seemed to expand impossibly, stretching beyond normal hours. There were mysterious study groups and curriculum planning sessions that never quite added up. During a quiet evening when Grant was resting comfortably upstairs, Henry found Gabriel at the kitchen table, half asleep over a stack of papers. He pulled out a chair and sat down beside his son. "Gabriel," Henry said softly, "we need to talk about these hours you're keeping." Gabriel straightened, instantly alert. "It's fine, Dad, really." "No, it's not." Henry reached for one of the papers on the table, not a lesson plan, but a pay stub from a local coffee shop. "What's this?" Gabriel's shoulders slumped. "I didn't want you to know," he admitted. "The tutoring wasn't enough, so I picked up some shifts at the coffee shop and—" He hesitated, then continued in a rush. "I'm doing online tech support in the evenings." Henry felt his heart crack. "3 jobs? Son, why?" "The medical bill," Gabriel's voice cracked. "I saw how worried you were about the costs. I just wanted to help. Grant's my brother, and you've done so much for us already." "Oh, Gabriel." Henry's voice was thick with emotion. "This isn't your burden to carry. You're sacrificing your own dreams, your career. What else can I do?" Gabriel's composed facade finally crumbled. "I sit there watching Grant get sicker, and you working yourself to exhaustion, and I feel so helpless. At least this way I'm doing something." Henry reached across the table and gripped Gabriel's hand. "Listen to me. Your responsibility right now is to build your future. That's what both Grant and I want for you. We'll figure out the medical expenses together, but not at the cost of your dreams." "But Dad—" "No buts." Henry's voice was firm but gentle. "You're more than just Grant's protector or my helper. You're Gabriel, and you deserve to pursue your own path." Tears welled in Gabriel's eyes. "I just want him to be okay," he whispered. Henry stood and pulled Gabriel into a tight hug, feeling his son's shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I know," he murmured. "We all do. But you don't have to carry this alone. Let me be the father you both need." Gabriel nodded against Henry's shoulder, and Henry held him tighter, silently promising to find a way forward that wouldn't require such painful sacrifices from his son. Henry walked through the quiet house, his footsteps echoing in the early morning stillness. His fingers traced the wall of the hallway where pencil marks tracked the boy's growth over the years. Each room held memories that tugged at his heart. The kitchen where his wife had taught him to bake her famous chocolate chip cookies. The living room where the boys had first called him Dad. In his study, Henry spread out the financial papers across his desk. The medical bills seemed to multiply every week, and the experimental treatments Dr. Patel recommended weren't covered by insurance. He pulled out a calculator, running the numbers again and again, but the conclusion remained the same. They needed more funds. The real estate agent, Mrs. Thompson, arrived precisely at 10 while the boys were at school and work. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floors as she toured the house, making notes and discussing market values. "It's a seller's market," she explained, her voice professional but kind. "With the location and condition, we could list it immediately." Henry nodded mechanically, his throat tight as she continued her assessment. Each room she evaluated felt like a betrayal of the memories it contained. In Grant's room, he spotted the model airplane they'd built together hanging from the ceiling. Gabriel's room still had the teaching certificates proudly displayed on the wall. That evening, during dinner, Grant pushed his peas around his plate and smiled. "Remember when we first moved in, and I was scared to sleep in my own room?" He laughed softly. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." Henry's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, trying to maintain his composure. Gabriel watched his father closely, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way his shoulders tensed. After dinner, while Grant rested upstairs, Gabriel approached Henry in the kitchen. "Dad," he said quietly, "whatever you're worried about, we'll figure it out together. This home, it's more than just walls and a roof. It's where we became a family." Henry turned to face his son, surprised by his perceptiveness. "The medical bills," he started. "We'll find another way," Gabriel interrupted firmly. "We always do." Later that night, Henry stood in the living room, holding a framed photograph. In it, his wife smiled broadly, her arms around Henry, whose face shone with happiness, and Henry remembered how his wife had insisted on taking the picture. He traced her face through the glass. "What would you have done, my love?" he whispered. The silence held no answers, but as he looked around the room, at the worn sofa where they'd spent countless family movie nights, at the coffee table still bearing rings from Grant's art projects, he knew he couldn't sell their sanctuary. Not yet. There had to be another solution. Henry placed the photograph back on the mantel and pulled out his phone to cancel tomorrow's follow-up with the real estate agent. The sterile hospital room felt smaller than usual as Henry, Gabriel, and Grant waited for Dr. Patel. The familiar beeping of machines and the antiseptic smell had become part of their routine, but today felt different. Grant sat on the examination table, his hospital gown making him look younger than his years, while Gabriel stood protectively nearby. When Dr. Patel entered, her expression was serious but held something else, a glimmer of possibility that made Henry sit up straighter. She carried a thick folder of test results, setting them carefully on her desk. "I have some unexpected news," she began, looking at the family. "We've been reviewing Gabriel's latest blood work, and he's a genetic match for a specialized bone marrow transplant that could potentially help Grant." The room fell silent. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he processed her words. "The procedure is complex," Dr. Patel continued, "but it offers a real chance at improvement. However, I want to be clear about the risks involved for both donor and recipient." Before she could elaborate, Gabriel stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said firmly, "whatever it takes." Henry reached out and grabbed Gabriel's arm. "Wait," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We need to understand everything first. The risks." "Dad," Gabriel interrupted gently, "I already know my answer." Dr. Patel spread out several documents on her desk. "The procedure requires extensive preparation. Gabriel would need to undergo multiple tests and treatments before the donation. There are risks of infection, complications from anesthesia, and a recovery period that could last weeks." Henry listened, his heart growing heavier with each detail. The thought of both his sons in medical danger made his hands shake. He watched Gabriel's unwavering expression, saw the determination in his eyes that reminded him so much of their mother. From the examination table, Grant spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Gabe, you don't have to do this. It's too dangerous." "Actually, I do have to," Gabriel replied, turning to his brother with a slight smile. "That's what family means. Remember when we were kids and you were afraid of the dark? I didn't leave you then, and I'm not leaving you now." Dr. Patel gave them time to absorb the information, watching as the family processed this new development. Henry stood up and paced the small room, his judicial mind trying to weigh all factors objectively, but his father's heart aching at the choice before him. "We can schedule preliminary testing next week," Dr. Patel suggested gently. "There's time to discuss this further as a family." Henry looked at his sons, Gabriel standing tall and certain, Grant worried but hopeful. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but Gabriel's quiet strength gave him courage. "Let's schedule the tests," Henry finally said, his voice steadier than he felt. As they left the hospital, he placed a hand on Gabriel's shoulder, squeezing gently. In the car, Gabriel broke the tense silence. "Hey, at least this means I get to skip a few days of work," he joked, making Grant roll his eyes and smile despite his concern. Gabriel sat across from Henry at the kitchen table, his hands clasped firmly in front of him. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting long shadows across their faces. A half-eaten piece of toast sat forgotten on Henry's plate, evidence of his distracted state of mind. "I've made my decision, Dad," Gabriel said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I'm going through with the transplant." Henry's fingers tightened around his coffee mug, the ceramic warm against his trembling hands. "Gabriel, the risks—" "I know about the risks," Gabriel interrupted gently, meeting his father's worried gaze. "I've read every pamphlet Dr. Patel gave us, twice. I even joined that online support group for donors." Henry rubbed his tired eyes, the sleepless nights of worry evident in the dark circles beneath them. There could be complications, the recovery period alone. "You've sacrificed everything for us," Gabriel said, leaning forward, his chair creaking slightly with the movement. "You took in 2 scared kids and gave us a home. You worked extra hours to pay for our school supplies. You're still working past retirement age to help with Grant's medical bills." His voice softened, thick with emotion. "Let me do this for our family." Henry studied his son's face, seeing not the frightened 10-year-old from years ago, but a determined young man. The kitchen clock ticked steadily in the background as he considered his response. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "Promise me you'll follow every precaution. Your health matters too." "I promise," Gabriel said with a small smile, pulling a folder from his backpack. "Besides, I've already filled out the consent forms." Later that morning, Gabriel met with Dr. Patel in her office, the antiseptic smell of the hospital familiar after so many visits. As he signed the final documents, his hand remained steady, the pen gliding smoothly across each page. Henry watched from nearby, his heart swelling with pride despite his worry, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets to hide their trembling. They found Grant waiting in the hallway, slumped in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, his face etched with concern. "I heard you talking earlier," he said quietly, fidgeting with the sleeve of his sweater. "Gabe, you don't have to do this because of me." Gabriel threw an arm around his brother's shoulders, pulling him close. "Come on, little brother. Someone's got to keep you around to beat at Monopoly." His light tone made Grant smile despite himself, some of the tension leaving his thin frame. "You're terrible at Monopoly," Grant protested, elbowing his brother playfully. "Exactly why I need you healthy so I can keep practicing." Henry watched his son's interaction from a few steps away, marveling at Gabriel's ability to ease tensions with humor while remaining resolute in his decision. The young man before him showed a strength of character that went beyond his years, reminding Henry of their mother's unwavering spirit. As Dr. Patel reviewed the pre-procedure requirements in her crisp, professional tone, Gabriel listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about the process. His calm determination seemed to steady everyone around him, even as they began preparing for the challenging days ahead. That evening, Henry found his sons in the living room, the soft glow of the table lamp creating a cozy atmosphere. Gabriel was showing Grant something on his phone, both of them laughing quietly together, their shoulders touching as they huddled over the screen. The sight of them, so close and supportive despite their fears, brought tears to Henry's eyes. He bowed his head, offering a silent prayer for both his boys as they faced this next challenge together, the love between them stronger than any obstacle they might encounter. The morning of the transplant dawned clear and crisp. Henry helped Gabriel pack his overnight bag while trying to keep his hands from shaking. The hospital corridors felt longer than usual as they made their way to the pre-op area. Gabriel sat on the edge of the hospital bed, already changed into the pale blue gown. His usual calm demeanor remained intact as nurses bustled around him, checking vitals and inserting IVs. "You know," Gabriel said, eyeing the breakfast tray nearby, "I thought hospital food was supposed to be bad, but this takes it to a new level. It makes Dad's burnt pancakes look gourmet." Grant laughed despite his obvious worry, and Henry felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Even now, Gabriel knew exactly how to lift their spirits. Dr. Patel arrived to explain the procedure one final time. As they wheeled Gabriel away, he gave his family a thumbs up and a crooked smile. The waiting room became Henry's world for the next several hours. He paced, attempted to read old magazines, and checked his phone constantly, though he knew updates would come directly from Dr. Patel. Grant dozed fitfully in one of the uncomfortable chairs, his face pale with concern. Finally, Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway, still wearing her surgical cap. "The procedure went well," she announced. "Gabriel is in recovery now. We'll monitor both boys closely over the next few days to track Grant's response to the transplant." Relief flooded through Henry as he followed her to the recovery room. Gabriel lay propped up against white pillows, looking tired but alert. His eyes flickered open when Henry took his hand. "Hey, Dad," he mumbled. "Did they save any of that amazing hospital food for me?" Henry choked out a laugh, squeezing his son's hand. "I'll smuggle in some real food once you're cleared to eat." Grant visited later that afternoon, shuffling into the room with tentative steps. "You look awful," he told his brother with a grin. "Still better looking than you," Gabriel shot back weakly. Over the next few days, the medical team noticed small but encouraging changes in Grant's blood work. Dr. Patel cautioned them about getting too excited too quickly, but Henry could see the optimism in her eyes during her rounds. "Your boys are fighters," she told Henry one morning while checking Gabriel's incision site. "Both of them." Henry gathered the medical team before discharge, expressing his gratitude through a voice thick with emotion. Gabriel insisted on walking to the car himself, though Henry hovered nearby just in case. As they drove home, Henry glanced in the rearview mirror. Grant was fast asleep, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. Gabriel sat in the front passenger seat, looking out the window at the familiar streets. "Next time we have a family dinner," Gabriel said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I vote we celebrate with anything except hospital pudding." Henry smiled, his heart full of cautious hope as they headed home together. Henry's car turned onto his street and he immediately noticed the crowd gathered in his driveway. His first instinct was concern, but as he drew closer, he saw familiar faces from church and the neighborhood, all wearing warm smiles. Pastor Evans stood at the center, holding a large banner that read, "Supporting the Pearson family." Tears welled in Henry's eyes as he stepped out of his car. Mrs. Thompson, who lived next door, approached with a box full of homemade cookies. "We couldn't stand by and watch you carry this burden alone," she said, her voice gentle. The driveway had been transformed into a makeshift marketplace. Tables lined the perimeter, laden with baked goods, handcrafted items, and silent auction donations. A donation box sat prominently at the center, already filled with checks and cash from generous neighbors. Gabriel emerged from the house, his eyes wide with surprise. He immediately began helping to organize the tables, his natural leadership showing through despite his recent recovery. Grant followed more slowly, still regaining his strength, but his face lit up at the sight of his former EMT instructors who had come to show their support. "Your wife would be so proud of you, Henry," Judge Eleanor Ward said, appearing at his side. "Sarah always believed in the power of community. She'd love seeing this." The afternoon buzzed with activity. Church members shared stories about Sarah, recalling her kindness and how she'd always been the first to organize help for others in need. Henry listened, his heart full, watching as Gabriel efficiently managed the silent auction while Grant sat at a card table, carefully writing thank you notes to each person who contributed. Mrs. Baker from the church choir presented a thick envelope. "The congregation took up a special collection," she explained. "We want to make sure Grant gets the best care possible." The sight of his usually reserved son Grant surrounded by well-wishers touched Henry deeply. Grant's smile, though tired, was genuine as he accepted handmade cards and words of encouragement from neighbors he'd known since moving in with Henry. Pastor Evans approached Henry with a ledger. "The silent auction alone has raised significant funds," he said, "and people are still coming with donations." Gabriel joined them, carrying a tray of lemonade he'd prepared for the volunteers. His face showed the same mix of gratitude and amazement that Henry felt. "Dad," he said quietly, I had no idea so many people cared this much. The kitchen counter gradually filled with casseroles and baked goods as the community ensured the family would have meals for weeks to come. Henry watched through the window as Grant shared a laugh with his former EMT instructor, looking more like himself than he had in weeks. Standing in his kitchen, surrounded by tangible evidence of his community's love, Henry felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Gabriel squeezed his shoulder in understanding, while Grant carefully arranged the thank you notes he'd written. The weight of their medical bills felt lighter somehow, shared by the dozens of people who had shown up to support them. The aroma of roasting chicken filled the kitchen as Henry carefully basted the bird, adding a sprinkle of herbs just the way Sarah had taught him years ago. Through the kitchen doorway, he could hear Gabriel and Grant playfully arguing about the proper way to fold napkins. "You're doing it wrong," Gabriel insisted, demonstrating his triangle fold with exaggerated precision. "Since when are you Martha Stewart?" Grant laughed, deliberately crumpling his napkin into a ball just to annoy his brother. Henry smiled to himself, savoring the sound of their banter. These moments felt precious after the long weeks of hospital visits and worried silences. Grant's color had returned, and his energy grew stronger each day. The dark circles under Gabriel's eyes had finally faded, replaced by his usual confident grin. "Dad, is this chicken ever going to be ready?" Grant called out. "I'm starving." "Patience is a virtue," Henry replied, using his best judge's voice, which made both boys snicker. When they finally gathered around the table, the conversation flowed easily. Gabriel launched into a story about one of his students who had written an entire essay about why homework should be illegal, complete with constitutional references. "Maybe you should have him come argue a case in Dad's court," Grant suggested, helping himself to a second serving of potatoes. "Speaking of careers," Gabriel said, "when are you heading back to EMT training?" Grant's face lit up. "Dr. Patel says maybe in 3 weeks if my numbers stay good. I can't wait to get back out there." "Well, of course you're doing well," Gabriel puffed up his chest dramatically. "You've got the bone marrow of a superior specimen. I think that makes me the official family hero." "Oh, please." Grant rolled his eyes, but his smile was warm. "You're never going to let me forget that, are you?" "Nope," Gabriel grinned. "I expect breakfast in bed every Sunday for the rest of my life." Henry watched his sons, his heart full. The fear that had gripped them all for so long had transformed into something beautiful, a deeper appreciation for each other, a stronger bond forged through trial. Gabriel raised his glass of soda. "To us, stronger than ever." The words were playful, but his eyes held meaning as they clinked their glasses together. After dinner, they settled into their usual spots in the living room. Henry took his favorite armchair while the boys sprawled on the couch. They found an old comedy playing on TV, one they'd watched countless times before. The familiar dialogue washed over them as they relaxed in comfortable silence. Henry looked at his sons, Gabriel absently explaining plot points to Grant, even though they both knew the movie by heart. Grant pretending to be annoyed, but smiling anyway. The peace of the moment settled over him like a warm blanket, and he allowed himself to fully believe in their healing, both physical and emotional. The hospital waiting room buzzed with quiet activity as Henry, Gabriel, and Grant sat together, waiting for Dr. Patel. Grant's fingers moved swiftly over a wooden puzzle, trying to separate the interlocked pieces. "I swear if I find another puzzle under my pillow," Gabriel teased, "I'm going to start hiding them in the microwave." Grant didn't look up from his puzzle. "You're just jealous because you can't solve the dragon one." "The dragon one is impossible," Gabriel protested. "I'm pretty sure you glued it together wrong on purpose." Henry watched their exchange with a small smile, grateful for these moments of normalcy. The familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee couldn't dampen their spirits, not when Grant had been doing so well these past months. Dr. Patel entered the room, his usual warm greeting absent. Something in his expression made Henry's stomach tighten. The doctor pulled up a chair, his movements deliberate and careful. "I'm afraid I have difficult news," Dr. Patel began softly. "The latest tests show that Grant's illness has returned, more aggressively than before." The puzzle pieces slipped from Grant's fingers, scattering across the floor. Nobody moved to pick them up. "But the transplant," Gabriel's voice cracked. "I thought—" Dr. Patel explained gently about the limited treatment options remaining. He used phrases like quality of life and palliative care, each word falling like a weight in the silent room. Henry's mind raced through every decision he'd made since becoming the boy's father. Had he missed something? Should he have pushed for different treatments earlier? His hands gripped the armrests of his chair as Dr. Patel continued explaining what palliative care would involve. Gabriel sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched tight. He'd positioned himself slightly in front of Grant, an unconscious gesture of protection that seemed especially futile now. Grant looked down at the scattered puzzle pieces, his face calm but pale. "It's okay, Dad," he said quietly, reaching for Henry's hand. "You did everything you could." That evening, the house felt different somehow. They sat in the living room, the TV off, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock. Gabriel mechanically sorted through Grant's puzzle pieces, though his eyes weren't focused on the task. Grant curled up in his favorite corner of the couch, watching his brother with a gentleness that made Henry's heart ache. As night fell, Henry remained in his armchair long after the boys had gone to bed. His tea had grown cold, untouched on the side table. The family photos on the wall seemed to watch him, snapshots of happier times, of first days of school, of the adoption celebration. Each image reminded him of promises he'd made, promises he now felt he couldn't keep. Henry sat alone in the back pew of the church, his shoulders heavy as sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows. Pastor Evans's voice carried through the sanctuary, speaking of trust in difficult times and the strength found in perseverance. The familiar words washed over Henry, but today they felt hollow, distant. "Even in our darkest moments," Pastor Evans said, his voice gentle but firm, "we must remember that we are not alone in our struggles." Henry's hands clasped tightly in his lap. The empty spaces beside him, where Gabriel and Grant usually sat, seemed to mock the pastor's words. How could he trust when everything was falling apart? How could he find peace when his son was slipping away despite all their prayers and efforts? At home later that afternoon, Henry stood by the living room window, watching leaves scatter across the yard. The house felt unusually quiet with Grant resting upstairs. He barely registered Gabriel's presence until his son cleared his throat softly. "Dad?" Gabriel's voice was hesitant, unusual for someone who always seemed so sure of himself. Henry turned, seeing the worry etched across Gabriel's face. They stood in silence for a moment before Gabriel spoke again. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep trying to be strong, for Grant and for you, but—" His words trailed off as he blinked back tears. Henry's heart ached at the sight of his usually composed son looking so vulnerable. "You know what amazes me, though," Gabriel continued, gathering himself. "How you've never given up on us. Even now, when everything feels impossible, you're still here, still fighting. That's what keeps me going." Gabriel moved closer, leaning against the window frame. "Remember when you first took us in? I was so sure it wouldn't last. But you proved me wrong, Dad. You showed up every single day, even when it was hard." Henry listened as Gabriel shared memories, small moments he hadn't realized had meant so much to his son. The time Henry stayed up all night helping with a school project. The way he never missed a parent-teacher conference, even during important trials. How he learned to cook Grant's favorite meals, even though he burned the first dozen attempts. "I don't know how to be as strong as you," Gabriel admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him, failing you." Henry reached out and pulled Gabriel into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered, feeling some of the weight lift from his chest. They stood together in the quiet room, father and son drawing strength from each other's presence. In that moment, Henry felt a small spark of faith return, not in grand miracles, but in the simple power of love and family to light the darkest paths. The morning sun cast long shadows across the driveway as Henry loaded the final beach bag into the trunk. He had spent the previous night carefully planning every detail of their surprise beach trip, determined to make it perfect. Grant stood nearby, wrapped in a light jacket despite the warm morning, his eyes bright with excitement. "I can't believe we're finally going to see the ocean," Grant said, his voice carrying a hint of wonder. Gabriel emerged from the house carrying a cooler filled with sandwiches and drinks. "Did you pack the sunscreen?" he asked, ever practical. "We don't want Dad turning into a lobster." Henry smiled, grateful for the moment of lightness. "It's in the blue bag along with enough snacks to feed an army." The drive to the coast was filled with comfortable conversation and old road trip games they used to play when the boys were younger. Grant pointed out interesting shapes in the clouds, while Gabriel shared stories from his teaching job. Henry kept glancing in the rearview mirror, memorizing their expressions of anticipation. When they arrived, the beach stretched before them in a sweep of golden sand. The waves rolled gently against the shore, their steady rhythm soothing and constant. Gabriel helped Grant across the sand, their steps leaving parallel tracks. "Look at this one," Grant called out, bending carefully to pick up a pristine shell. He handed it to Henry, who turned it over in his hands, admiring its pearlescent surface. They walked along the water's edge, pants rolled up as the cool waves lapped at their ankles. Gabriel held Grant's arm, supporting him as they ventured slightly deeper. Their laughter carried across the beach when a larger wave surprised them, soaking the edges of their clothes. "Remember when we first moved in?" Grant said later, sitting on a beach towel beside Henry. "And you tried to make us pancakes?" Henry chuckled. "They were more like hockey pucks." "But we ate them anyway," Gabriel added, snapping a photo of them with his phone, "because we'd never had anyone care enough to try." Together, they began building a sandcastle, Grant directing the construction with surprising attention to detail. "The tower needs to be taller," he insisted, showing Gabriel how to pack the sand just right. Henry watched his sons work together, their hands shaping towers and walls, their faces relaxed and happy. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, they spread out a blanket and sat together, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The waves continued their eternal dance with the shore, and a gentle breeze carried the salt air around them. Grant leaned against Henry's shoulder, his voice soft but content. "This is perfect," he whispered, and Henry wrapped an arm around him, holding this moment close to his heart. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the weathered deck of the beach house as Henry, Gabriel, and Grant settled around the small patio table for breakfast. The rhythmic sound of waves provided a peaceful backdrop to their meal of toast, eggs, and fresh fruit. The salt-laden breeze ruffled Grant's hair as he picked at his breakfast, seeming lost in thought. "Dad?" Grant said suddenly, his voice steady despite his usual morning fatigue. "Could we take a walk together, all three of us?" Henry noticed that Grant looked stronger than he had in weeks, his eyes clear and bright in the morning light. "Of course," he replied, sharing a quick glance with Gabriel. They made their way down to the beach, walking slowly to accommodate Grant's pace. The morning air was crisp, and few people were out this early. Their footprints traced a meandering path along the damp sand as they walked in comfortable silence. When they reached a collection of rocks jutting out from the beach, Grant gestured for them to stop. He turned to face Henry, his expression serious but peaceful. "I've been wanting to say something," Grant began, his voice steady. "Dad, you gave us something Gabriel and I never thought we'd have again. A father who truly loves us, who chose us." His eyes grew misty as he continued. "You changed our whole world that night at the courthouse, and every day since then you've shown us what real love looks like." Gabriel stepped closer to his brother, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Grant's right," he added, his usual protective reserve giving way to raw emotion. "You and Grant, you both taught me what it means to be strong, what it means to be family." Henry felt his heart swell with both pride and an aching tenderness as he listened to his son's words. Grant reached out and took both their hands, forming a small circle on the rocky outcrop. "When you feel sad," Grant said softly, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember how much love we have right here, right now. Remember how perfect it is to just be together like this." They stood there for several minutes, the waves providing a gentle symphony to their shared silence. Finally, they made their way back to the beach house, spending the remainder of the day in quiet companionship. They played cards, shared stories, and simply sat together, savoring each precious moment. As evening approached and the sky turned a deep purple, Grant hugged them both tightly before heading to bed. "I love you," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of everything they meant to each other. Henry settled into one of the wooden chairs on the porch afterward, gazing up at the emerging stars. In his heart, he felt a deep connection to his late wife, grateful for the way she had somehow led him to this family, to this love that had transformed all their lives. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as Henry stirred pancake batter, adding chocolate chips the way Grant loved them. From upstairs came the familiar sounds of Gabriel helping Grant start his day. Their quiet voices drifted down, punctuated by occasional laughter. "Easy does it," Gabriel said as he and Grant appeared in the kitchen doorway. Grant moved slowly but steadily, his color noticeably better than it had been in weeks. "Something smells amazing," Grant said, easing into his usual chair at the kitchen table. His eyes brightened at the sight of the pancakes taking shape on the griddle. Throughout the morning, Grant's improved energy showed in small but meaningful ways. He insisted on helping clear the breakfast dishes, though Henry and Gabriel hovered nearby. Later, he settled into the living room with Gabriel, who was sorting through a stack of student papers. "Let me help," Grant offered, reaching for a pile of math worksheets. "I always was better at numbers than you." Gabriel chuckled, passing him the papers and a red pen. "Just don't be too harsh on them. They're only fourth graders." As they worked together, Gabriel watched his brother's careful attention to each paper. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "seeing you tackle these problems reminds me why I loved teaching in the first place. The way you explain things. It's so clear and patient." Grant looked up, meeting his brother's eyes. "You should go back to it, teaching, I mean. Part-time at least." Henry, who had been quietly reading nearby, lowered his book to listen. "I've been thinking about it," Gabriel admitted. "Watching you face everything with such courage. It's made me realize we can't put our dreams on hold forever. You taught me that." The afternoon found them gathered around the kitchen table, playing their favorite card game. Grant's competitive spirit showed through as he laid down a winning hand, prompting groans from both Henry and Gabriel. "Still the reigning champion," Grant declared with a grin. Later, they took advantage of the mild weather for a drive through the countryside. Grant sat in the front passenger seat, window rolled down slightly to feel the breeze. They passed golden fields and flowering trees, with Grant pointing out particularly beautiful spots along the way. "Remember when we first moved in with Dad?" Grant asked, glancing at Gabriel in the back seat. "How we used to take Sunday drives like this." "And you always fell asleep before we got home," Gabriel teased. The day wound down with them gathered in the living room. Henry watched as his sons shared an inside joke, their laughter filling the room with warmth. Grant's eyes sparkled with mischief as he delivered the punchline to a story from their childhood, and Gabriel's responding grin was full of affection. In that moment, Henry felt overwhelming gratitude for these precious days together, for the sound of their mingled laughter, and for the love that bound them as a family. A few weeks passed. The midnight silence was broken only by the gentle hum of medical equipment and the occasional soft beep of the heart monitor. Henry stirred from his light sleep in the worn leather armchair, his paternal instincts drawing him to check on Grant. In the dim light of Grant's bedroom, filtered through cream-colored curtains, he found Gabriel already there, holding his brother's hand with tender care, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion. The moonlight cast soft shadows across Grant's peaceful face as he slept, his features relaxed and free from pain. Henry settled into the chair opposite Gabriel, their vigil shared in understanding silence, both drawing comfort from each other's steady presence. The wall clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of precious moments, each second feeling both fleeting and eternal. As the hours crept toward dawn, they noticed Grant's breathing becoming slower, more measured, like gentle waves on a quiet shore. Henry reached out to smooth Grant's dark hair, the gesture full of fatherly love, his fingers lingering with each stroke. Gabriel's grip on his brother's hand remained steady, his thumb tracing gentle circles, a connection maintained until the very end. The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky when Grant took his final, peaceful breath. The moment passed with such quiet grace that it felt like a whisper carried on a gentle breeze. Henry and Gabriel's eyes met across the bed, sharing an unspoken understanding that Grant had slipped away, their hearts connected in profound grief and love. Henry moved closer, taking Grant's other hand in his own, feeling its lingering warmth. His touch was gentle as he thanked his son silently for the joy and love he had brought to their lives, for every smile, every laugh, every precious moment shared. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks, but his heart was full of gratitude for having had Grant in his life, for the privilege of being his father. Gabriel stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if the world might shatter with any sudden motion. Without a word, he stepped out of the room and onto the back porch, his sock-covered feet making no sound on the wooden floors. The cool morning air met his tear-stained face as he processed the reality of losing his twin, his other half. Despite his grief, he found comfort in knowing Grant's passing had been peaceful, surrounded by love, exactly as his brother would have wanted it. Inside, Henry remained by Grant's side, his thoughts filled with memories of their time together. Baseball games, family dinners, quiet evenings spent reading. When Gabriel returned, his eyes red but composed, they worked together quietly to make the necessary calls. Their movements were measured and respectful as they contacted Dr. Patel and began the arrangements that needed to be made, each task a final act of love for Grant. As sunrise painted the sky in soft pinks and golds, Henry and Gabriel found themselves in the living room, drawn together by their shared loss. They sat close together on the familiar brown couch, drawing strength from each other's presence. Though the house felt strangely empty, almost too quiet, the love that had bound them together as a family remained palpable in the morning light, filling every corner with bittersweet memories. Gabriel leaned slightly against his father's shoulder, accepting the comfort of his presence, finding solace in the familiar scent of his aftershave. Henry wrapped an arm around his remaining son, their shared grief and love expressed in the simple gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. The morning light streamed through the windows, touching the family photos that lined the walls, each one a testament to the joy Grant had brought to their lives, his spirit living on in every captured moment and cherished memory. The morning dawned clear and calm, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the old oak trees surrounding the church. Henry and Gabriel stood side by side at the entrance, their dark suits a stark contrast to the bright autumn day. They greeted the steady stream of mourners with quiet dignity, accepting embraces and words of comfort from friends and neighbors who had become family over the years. Dr. Patel arrived early, his usually professional demeanor softened by genuine grief. He clasped Henry's hand warmly, then pulled Gabriel into a brief embrace. Church members filed in, many carrying covered dishes and flowers, their faces reflecting the community's shared loss. Inside the church, sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews. Henry made his way to the pulpit, his hands steady on the smooth wood as he began to speak. His voice, though thick with emotion, carried clearly through the hushed sanctuary. "I met my sons on a cold evening behind the courthouse," Henry began, sharing the story of that fateful night. "What started as an act of kindness became the greatest blessing of my life." He spoke of Grant's quiet strength, his ability to find joy in simple moments, and the way his presence had filled an empty house with laughter and love. Gabriel followed, his measured steps echoing in the quiet church. Standing where his father had moments before, he shared memories that brought both laughter and tears to the congregation. He told stories of Grant's determination during EMT training, his notorious sweet tooth, and the countless times he had made them laugh even during the darkest days of his illness. "My brother," Gabriel said, his voice steady despite his tears, "taught me more about courage and love than anyone else ever could." Dr. Patel shared his own tribute, speaking of Grant's unwavering optimism and the way he had inspired other patients. Pastor Evans recalled Grant's thoughtful questions during Sunday school and his genuine desire to help others, even while facing his own challenges. The slideshow played across the church wall, images of their life together flowing one into another. There was Grant on his first day in Henry's home, uncertain but hopeful. Grant and Gabriel at their adoption celebration, their faces lit with joy. Grant in his EMT uniform, proud and determined. Each photo told a story of love, family, and the bonds that had grown stronger through every challenge. A family friend's voice rose in Grant's favorite hymn, the melody carrying memories of Sunday mornings spent together in these same pews. The congregation joined softly, their voices blending in harmony as sunlight continued to stream through the windows. The final prayer echoed through the church, a testament to Grant's impact on their lives. As the service concluded, Henry and Gabriel made their way to the gravesite, where they carefully placed flowers on the fresh earth. Henry's whispered goodbye carried all the love of a father for his son, his promise to keep Grant's memory alive hanging in the quiet afternoon air. The evening settled over the Pearson home like a heavy blanket. Henry and Gabriel stepped through the front door, their dress shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. The house felt different now, emptier, quieter, as if the very walls missed Grant's presence. In the kitchen, Henry warmed up casseroles brought by church members, while Gabriel set the table for two. The simple act of placing only 2 plates instead of 3 made his hands tremble slightly. They ate in companionable silence, the occasional clink of silverware the only sound breaking through their thoughts. After dinner, they found themselves drawn to the back porch, seeking comfort in the familiar space where they'd spent countless evenings as a family. The wooden swing creaked gently as they settled in, the cooling night air wrapping around them. "Remember when Grant switched all the sugar in the kitchen with salt?" Gabriel said suddenly, a small smile playing at his lips. "You were so confused when your coffee tasted terrible that morning." Henry chuckled, the memory warming his heart. He couldn't keep a straight face, gave himself away immediately. He paused, then added, "I'll never forget the day he came home from his first EMT training session. His eyes were so bright, so full of purpose. He was meant for that work," Gabriel agreed, his voice soft with pride. Even when he couldn't finish the training himself, he never lost that desire to help others. They traded stories back and forth, sometimes laughing, sometimes wiping away tears. Gabriel spoke about his plans to return to teaching full-time, his voice growing stronger as he described his vision for the future. "Grant always said I was born to teach," Gabriel reflected. "He used to tease me about practicing my lectures on him when we were kids." Henry nodded, feeling a surge of pride for both his sons. "Being your father, both of your father, has been the greatest gift of my life. You and Grant taught me more about love and courage than I ever thought possible." Gabriel straightened up, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking, what if we created a scholarship in Grant's name for EMT students who show the same kind of dedication he did?" "That's perfect," Henry replied without hesitation, reaching out to squeeze Gabriel's shoulder. "Grant would love knowing he's still helping others follow their dreams." As night settled in fully, they remained on the porch, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Gabriel's hand found Henry's, and they sat in comfortable silence, their grip firm and reassuring. Though the loss of Grant weighed heavily on their hearts, they found solace in their shared memories and the unshakable bond that remained between them. The stars twinkled overhead, reminding them of countless nights spent stargazing as a family. Though Grant was no longer physically present, his love remained, as constant and bright as the stars above. If you enjoyed the story of Gabriel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.